Good morning, everybody. My name is Sydney Smith, and I'm on the Faith Formation Committee, and I'm here to welcome you to this discussion and presentation by Mel. I was thinking about how the condition of being human is to grieve, and grief is with us all of our lives. We have grief for people close to us, our loved ones, parents, siblings, partners, children. We have grief for friends and friendships that have dissipated in ways that we don't understand. We have grief for what we see in the world. We have grief for what's going on to the planet. We have griefs that are social about how it is that there's so much pain and suffering in the world. And we come to realize that grief can be slow, it can be fast, it can be explosive, it can be quiet, it can be raucous, it can be raw, and it can be sweet. Grief is a very complicated way of being human, to grieve. And Mel is one of those people that has this amazing ability to talk with people about their griefs and to help us think through what the process of grieving is and how we walk with it and live with it. So she's here to talk to us about befriending grief.
Questions? Just leave this over here. All right, if you know anything about me, you know I have an uneasy teacher. I'm better with small groups, but I'm going to talk at you for a little while today, so I hope you have coffee. Before we do that, though, let's have a prayer. Dear God, you always draw near to the brokenhearted, and that is everyone in this room. And everyone who lives a life. Be with us and draw near. Bless us with your presence and your comfort and your wisdom and your courage. We pray through Christ our Lord. Amen. So because I'm going to talk at you, I'd like to start with this poem that you have in front of you. It's by John O'Donohue, and we're going to hear it read aloud in different voices here. I'll start with Ellen, who will introduce it.
Silence of absence deepens, flickers of guilt kindle regret for all that was left unsaid or undone.
There are days when you wake up happy, again inside the fullness of life, until the moment breaks and you are thrown back onto the black tide of loss.
Days when you have your heart back, you are able to function well, until in the middle of work or encounter, suddenly, with no warning, you are ambushed by grief.
It becomes hard to trust yourself. All you can depend on now is that sorrow will remain faithful to itself. More than you, it knows its way and will find the right time to pull the rope of grief until that coiled hill of tears has reduced to its last drop.
Gradually, you learn acquaintance with the invisible form of your departed, and when the work of grief is done, the wound of loss will heal, and you will have learned to wean your eyes from that gap in the air, and be able to enter the hearth in your soul, where your loved one has awaited your return all the time.
Beautiful. That's a piece that we give out when we have it available. It usually goes out in the compassion kit, the care kit that the deacons deliver when someone in our church has had a loss of someone close to them. So you may have seen that piece before. on, Tom. Come on in. We just read the piece that you have before you and had a prayer now in the beginning, so just on time. In my freshman year in college, on January 26th, my dorm room phone rang. It was my mom calling to give me the horrible news that my high school sweetheart had been killed. Pushing his old, broken-down MG along the side of the road after a late-night wrestling match, a drunk driver hit Jay so hard he flew out of his shoes, killing him immediately, just a half mile from his home. Although we had broken up a few days before I left for college, just months earlier, the loss was immediately unraveling to me, even more unspeakable and tragic for his parents and his two twin brothers who were just 7 years old. It was in all ways unbearable. My dear Jay's death was the first loss I encountered of significance. I had lost pets and some distant family members, but this one really counted. I was 18. It was unexpected, sudden, immediate, and complete. Because I was away at college at some distance, I was forced to encounter it from there, missing the people who could have better understood my pain, including my church family and pastor, who might have been able to advise me. My mother wanted to shield me from pain and would not pay for me to return home for his funeral. I never saw his dead body in the casket. I was not given the chance to sit with his parents or brothers and our mutual friends and reminisce and cry and share. And I never told him I really loved him, and I was never able to say goodbye. This was a kind of adolescent grief. It didn't have a depth or breadth of experience or maturity to help it, and it was at a distance. These and other factors shaped how I reacted. I remember going into the stairwell of my dormitory to find private space to think about all of this and to be alone with my feelings, and I began to sob. I felt like I was falling apart, an out-of-control sensation that I, a very in-control young woman, found strange and disorienting. I distinctly remember saying to myself, I will never feel this way again. I will never let this kind of feeling get in. This is not who I am. I was so sure I could master these emotions. Like so many 18-year-olds, I was idealistic, still a stranger to the power of my feelings and the way our subconscious may lead us to overreach. We don't feel our feelings. We are our feelings. It is all of us. Because we and everyone we love will die, we are made to grieve. It is essential to who we are. We cannot be who we are without loss, any more than we can be who we are without love. At 54, I am just beginning to know this me, if I'm honest with myself and realistic about the journey we all take of life and loss. I am now coming to know this me in yet another way, as my own spouse, my husband of 24 years, died in the late spring of 2022 after 7 years of being ill. He took his last breath 613 days ago. And I am a student of grief once again, now in a deeper way, in a different way. This loss doesn't bring shock or injustice like my friend's death. This grief contains within it a kind of relief. I am a mourner, I am a griever, and a public one at that, a person with a heart-shaped hole right in the middle of my body. This was and is all of us at different times over the course of our lives. Let's go back to that cold college stairwell in 1988 on the campus at the University of Alabama. A very clear memory of mine is thinking to myself, this is the worst thing I'll ever felt. I'll never feel this again. I made a decision to master grief. I determined I would have the upper hand on it. And this decision left me with two options. Either I would never let anyone get in so close that I hurt like that again, clearly thoughts of a naive college freshman, or I would try to master grief by coming to terms with it intellectually and figure out how to disempower it from overwhelming me. While both were impossibilities, I wasn't ready to see grief as a part of life, a critical facet of who we are and how we live our days. What I knew of grief then was that it set me apart, and it made me different from the rest of the freshmen around me, joyfully chugging their beers on weekends and laughing with friends over dinner in the dormitory. I felt it marked me somehow. Like all of you who have grieved before, you know I was just trying to manage my agony. First, I tried not letting love in, for if we don't have great love, we won't have great pain. That was short-sighted and incredibly lonely, isolating, even depressing. Eventually, I was defeated by love of many kinds. It just took a while. It was a decade before my defenses would be badly defeated by romantic love, and I thank God for that treasure now. Beyond that, I tried mastering feelings of loss by getting a master's degree that focused on grief in the family system, the grief in the family me. My goal was to objectify grief, to study it, to dissect it, to manage it. The Apostle Paul wrote that if we have all knowledge but have not love, we are nothing and we gain nothing. So for all the books on my shelf and all the papers I've written, I've not come to control grief, just to perhaps be more attuned to its many facets. Eventually, I realized the futility of any approach other than coming to terms with grief, accepting love and making peace with loss, and ultimately embracing grief not as a foe, but perhaps as a friend. After all, if it's going to be with you and remain with you, why make it the enemy? We all encounter grief, we all feel it, we all suffer its presence. Nobody escapes it, no one masters it, not even Jesus, who wept when he learned his friend Lazarus had died. We learn to live with it, to make it a part of us. It seasons the rest of our life. When I was growing up, my mother, a good South Carolinian, used to put salt on her watermelon and her cantaloupe. My siblings and I thought this was bizarre. But she helped us to see that the salt brought out the sweetness. The bitter seasoning made what was so tasty even more delicious. And I have come to think of grief a little more like that. As painful as it is, embracing grief is to know how it enhances everything else we encounter in life. Your first major loss is the most memorable for the way that first grief shaped your ability to move through subsequent griefs. Or perhaps not. It's a pet, often, a foretaste of more profound grief, but then a grandparent, or a parent, or teacher, or friend. The reality of loss of someone close to us, someone who meant something to us, someone no longer available to us, someone who perhaps suffered or struggled in a way that we could not change, is profound and it is life-changing, particularly when there are relationships that had unfinished business. Grief is compounded when the hope of reconciliation is kept at bay. I'd like you to think about your losses. I'd like you to think about your most significant griefs. However debilitating grief could be, something allowed you to move on, to get out of bed, to stand up, and to recover. Your life went on and you learned to carry grief in some way, perhaps in a way that empowered you, perhaps in a way that shaped you, maybe still does. What allowed you to keep going? Was it the mere passage of time? Perhaps prayer, therapy, and counseling? Ding, ding, ding for me. Was it reading books on grief? Yes. Maybe it was a period of too much alcohol. Been there. Too much exercise. Been there too. Learning to meditate or do yoga. Acupuncture. Very good for grief, by the way. Blowing your budget on cheese and dark chocolate, as my friend Nis sometimes does. What absolutely did not help at all? Who was it that helped you to live again, and why did those particular people matter to your bereavement? What have you learned over the course of multiple moments of deep sadness at life's ending, both in terms of what you need and what you think other people need in your life who are grieving? So let me just give you a few seconds to reflect on those questions. Perhaps you have something you'd like to share as these answers are coming to you. If something emerges, I want to give you a space to say it before I keep talking at you. I hope that you will ponder these questions, because in your answers you will find a guide for yourself and how to draw near to those around you who are grieving. Likely, whether you've tried or not, if you are on the other side of grief, you've done a few key things. And when I say on the other side of grief, I don't mean you're over it. I mean you're functioning, you're not sad all the time, you're not drowning in depression, you're not paralyzed by the past. You are having a life of meaning with moments of joy. And most of all, some of your grief has been fully transformed into gratitude. For some of us in this room, we are actually right now moving through grief, coping, breathing, wondering how long we will be preoccupied with these feelings. It could be anticipatory grief that you carry today because you're caring for someone who is dying. Or it could be grief that has been delayed, that is just now rising up after a time when it's been repressed for a while. I'm feeling some of that now in my own life. But if we are grieving now, we are likely wondering how long we will be distracted, exhausted, teary, short-term, short-tempered, depressed, all behaviors that emerge in a state of grief. Grief expert William Worden wrote that there are 4 tasks of mourning. 1, to accept the reality of the loss, to intellectually recognize it and to be able to explain it to someone else. 2, to experience the pain of that loss. Number 3, to adjust to an environment in which the deceased is missing. And number 4, to withdraw emotional energy from that grief and to reinvest it in new relationships. That doesn't mean a new partner, perhaps. It just means putting yourself out there to care for others and be cared for. What Worden intellectually names others illuminated before him. I'm sure you've heard the name Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. 54 years ago this year, that's how old I am, gave us language to think about the stages of grief, something we later came to see weren't stages at all to be worked through in sequence, but different aspects of the grieving process that might come in waves. Shock, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. These are mere aspects of grief that most of us encounter in different measures, depending on everything about the loss. Therese Rando, I recommend her work, pointed out that grief is not mourning. Grief is an involuntary reaction to loss, whereas mourning is an ongoing active process towards acceptance. She named 3 phases of mourning: avoidance, confrontation, and accommodation. The 3 phases of actively moving towards and through grief: avoidance, confrontation, and accommodation. We are blessed in 2024 to have so much more knowledge about the grieving process, so much more attention paid to grief and the importance of understanding it and naming it and learning from it. There are books and articles and whole journals, not to mention podcasts and apps you can download on your phone that will guide you through it. And all of that is good. And while we can't master grief, we can normalize it. We can learn about it. We cannot beat ourselves up for not gaining power over it. We can get to know it. A dynamic experience of grief happens multiple times in life, is different every time, and each time is impacted by all the times we have visited grief and been visited by it before. What must we do, I think, to befriend it? How do we befriend grief? I realize at this point of life, this is a renewed invitation to friendship for me and for you. But there are many griefs each of us will have ahead of us. Some will be familiar to you, some will be expected, and some will not. Martha Pasternak wrote a blog post that ended up in the Huffington Post back in 2012. And here's what she said about where we are in midlife and beyond. And whether you're in this place or not, I think you'll take some wisdom from her paragraph. It's slightly lengthy, but hang in there with me. She writes, "This time of life immerses us in grief beyond our imagination. Think of what a year might bring. Our parents naturally pass away when we are in midlife. Friends too close to our own begin to die from natural causes rather than accidents or bizarre circumstances. Our children leave home and launch their own adult lives. We grieve the loss of freedom. Our physical youthfulness fades as we get emotionally, mentally, and spiritually bolder, and things we held as important suddenly don't seem that important anymore. We grieve the loss of passion. Our marriages, if they survive the periodic chaos, are now called long-term marriages. We are not the same people we were when we entered them. That may well suit us or not, depending on who it is we have become as older adults. We may yearn for the good old days. Maybe our marriages did not survive the chaos inherent in intimate relationships, and we find ourselves alone when our dream was to be otherwise. For many of us, the fact that dreams change or simply fade away was not in our awareness 30 years ago. We become disillusioned. In midlife and beyond, we relax and sometimes even release our tenacious grasp on principles, values, and desires. Letting go and releasing dreams, goals, and desires can be very challenging. Sometimes our long-held dreams seem like sand sifting through our fingers. We grieve the loss of possibility. And the thing is, at least in my experience, the reasons I grieve seem to be piling up in midlife before I get over it. To me, it feels like I sink below the surface on an ocean of grief and become submerged again after I get too tired to tread water. Just as I think I may pop above the surface, the next loss occurs and I slowly sink under again. I remember the moment it felt like in order to survive, I had to conjure the courage to breathe underwater. It happened after my father died. It occurred to me that grief may be a part of midlife naturally and that getting over it was an unrealistic expectation. Grief just may become a familiar and regular presence in my life now. Living in a state of exuberance with a willingness to let go of the past while being a person who grieves is my task. At the bottom of this deep well of grief is the love I seek. Once again, I am able to open my heart up to freedom, dreams, passion, possibility, and love. Grief may, in fact, be a friend misunderstood, and one that allows me the space to renew myself physically and mentally and emotionally and spiritually. So given those very wise words from that woman, how can we befriend grief? Well, let's be honest. If grief is a friend, it is an annoying one that wants our attention. It bothers us and keeps us up at night and wants to drink with us, then wakes us up in the middle of the night and wants us to take some sleeping pills, makes us cry in places where we want to go unnoticed like church or synagogue. Grief is a friend that wears us out, that keeps distracting us from the positive things we want to pursue and the long list of things we need to get done. Grief is the friend that demands to go on vacation with us even though we want to get away. Like any friend, grief hurts us, lets us down, and is complex. Like any friend, grief often has too much to say and doesn't listen very well and doesn't do what we ask it to do. Grief is a friend who has its own way of doing things. It is a friend who might go silent for a while, even for a few years, but then returns, looking different, related to new people and new places. And yet, like any friend, there are things we actually love about it. So remembering those things, how can we befriend grief? Well, let's look at a few positive parts to this potential friend, and I know you'll be able to add your own. First, when we are grieving, we are remembering. Listen to these wise words from German pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer. There's nothing that can replace the absence of someone dear to us, and one should not even attempt to do so. One must simply hold out and endure it. At first that sounds very hard, but at the same time it is also a great comfort. For to the extent that emptiness truly remains unfilled, one remains connected to the other person through it. It is wrong to say that God fills the emptiness. God in no way fills it, but leaves it precisely unfilled, and thus helps us to preserve, even in pain, the authentic relationship. Furthermore, the more beautiful and full the remembrances, the more difficult the separation. But gratitude transforms the torment of memory into silent joy. one bears what was lovely in the past, not as a thorn, but as a precious gift deep within a hidden treasure of which one can always be certain. When we are grieving, we are remembering. When I am sad about Jay's death or Jim's death, I miss them and who they were, but I am also with them. My mother died in April of 2018 and my father in March of 2019. When moments of sadness come to me, I stop and attend to them. I give grief my attention. I stop and I talk to my loved ones. Today when Hannah was doing the children's sermon, she said, "Who is someone that you know really well?" And I knew just who I was thinking of. And a wave of grief just came over me, and the tears came to my eyes, and I decided to stop listening to her and start listening to me. I talk to my loved ones. I tell them something of my life. I ask them what heaven is like, even though I know Jim didn't believe it. I often ask them for help just in case they have the ear and heart of the Lord or God or whatever the divine presence in the world who already knows my heart and my prayers, but might like to hear from others who know me. And then I try to listen, and I spend time with those I have loved and given back to God. I listen to grief. What does grief have to say if we listen? What do those we have loved and lost have to offer us when we return to them after days or weeks or years? How have they and we changed? What do we say to one another? We are spending time with those we love when we grieve. They are still with us in those moments. And when I am not thinking of them and grieving, the people I have loved and lost still shape me and are impactful in my experiences because they're deep within me. Number 2, grief as a friend asks us to shift our perspective. Loss often leaves us in the why place. Why did this happen to him, to her, to me? Why am I suffering? What have I done to deserve this? Grief makes us into such a narcissist at times. And the why questions can be overwhelming and paralyzing, truly. But grief as a friend forces us to refocus on the how questions, the really important and ultimately the only answerable questions in life. How do we live with this loss? How do we turn it into something meaningful, even good? How can we take this experience and use it so that the pain is not in vain, but it's ultimately redemptive, perhaps somewhat redemptive, even a little bit redemptive? Third, grief changes us, and grief changes. Grief lends us something: credibility, believability, realness. Like the Velveteen Rabbit, we're worse for the wear, but so much more lovable and present. Grief gives us a kind of status. It allows us immediate entry into the lives of those who are suffering. We have the right, we have the courage to ask to be present, and perhaps not to ask, but maybe just to show up. This takes an intuitive gift that we ask God to help us hone. We sometimes know something of the feelings that others are having, and we have learned to live in that place. We have something to lend, especially when we're invited to share those things. If we are not, our experience allows us to walk beside and behind someone quietly until we are invited. But even more, grief changes. It is not a static friend. It is ever evolving. It is ever aging. And like us, it shifts and morphs and looks different on different days. And when we learn to get along with it, it looks a lot more like gratitude than it does sadness and loss. Now, with these 3 things in mind and your own thoughts and reflections in your heart, I want to conclude a part of this by reading some passages for your reflection. And the first comes from 2 Corinthians 4, beginning with verse 7. Listen for what we learn about grief from these passages. St. Paul writes, "But we have this treasure in clay jars so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. We are afflicted in every way but not crushed, perplexed but not driven to despair, persecuted but not forsaken, struck down but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies. For while we live, we are always being given up to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be made visible in us. So death is at work in us, but life in you. For just as we have the same spirit of faith as in accordance with Scripture, I believed and so I spoke, we also believe and so we speak, because we know that the one who raised Jesus will raise us also and will bring us with you into his presence. Yes, everything is for your sake, so that grace extends to more people and may increase thanksgiving. So we do not lose heart. Even though our outer nature is wasting away, our inner nature is being renewed every day. For this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for a weight of glory beyond all measure. Because we look not at what can be seen, but at what cannot be seen. For what can be seen is temporary. What cannot be seen is eternal. The second reading comes from an anonymous source, but it's a statement that has come to have meaning for many of us. Wish I knew who wrote these words. Wish it had been me. I had my own notion of grief. I thought it was the sad time that followed the death of someone you love, and you had to push through it to get to the other side. But I'm learning there is no other side. There is no pushing through, but rather there is absorption, adjustment, acceptance. And grief is not something you complete, but rather you endure. Grief is not a task to finish and move on, but an element of yourself, an alteration of your being, a new way of seeing and a new definition of self. See, friends, grief is a part of us. It is with us for a reason. It's unavoidable. Death is not the enemy. It is the doorway to something more. Loss is not defeat. It is an opportunity for change. Pain is not permanent. It is a state of being with purpose, something knowable. When we do, by the grace of God, get to the other side of it, with it. So no matter the loss, the circumstances, or the feelings of sadness, each of us can get to a place where the feelings of loss and grief, and the process of working through those feelings, called mourning, have purpose and meaning, and have a presence in our life that makes us more grateful, makes us able to have a richer experience of all that God has to offer us. And when we do that, we honor our loved ones. We celebrate their lives among us. And we can believe as Christians that they are willing us on to get to that place. None of us have someone we love that is sitting up there saying, please keep being sad for my sake. Please stop living and having joy, because I was too damned important for you to keep going forward and to live a life of joy. Before we get into a few small group discussions, I want to recommend a couple of resources to you today. A couple of books that I like, and I'll send this to you, as well as last week's memorial planning notes, which had a lot of resources too. If you'd like, just email me that you need those if you weren't here last week. The Cure for Sorrow by Jan Richardson, one of the best books on grief. It is a book of blessings, but the prologue to that book contains that favorite line of mine: grief is the least linear thing we know. And then Bearing the Unbearable Love, Loss, and the Heartbreaking Path of Grief by Joanna Cacciatore. There's so many good ones that you can name. The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. Do not miss that resource. Any suggestions that you would add to that list today? Anyone have something that comes to mind that's been helpful to you? A book on grief, perhaps. Bill.
Book that I've given two people very near and dear to me.
I'm going to bring the microphone on just so our people listening online can hear.
Okay. So it's a book. I'm going to describe a book that was very near and dear to me. As you're very well aware, almost 2 years ago, my wife passed. You did a marvelous job of memorial service. At the end of a year of grieving and mourning, I looked at a stack of books next to her bedside, and at the top of that was a book. I just picked up spontaneously and started reading and couldn't put down. Very important, and I think it was part of the Presbyterian book club, if you want to call it that, Presbyterian, called the phone booth at the edge of the world.
You all heard of this? The phone book at the end of the world.
And that single book changed my entire outlook on life going forward. Because it's looking back and it's looking forward with hopefulness. And it has changed my perspective. Within 1 year, I felt a complete weight lifted off my shoulders. I've looked forward with great anticipation to relationship that you facilitated. And that book alone, I will say, was very important to me. The phone booth at the end of the world, the edge of the world, whatever it is, that I recommend to anybody.
Go get it today, friends. I have a copy from you. It is an amazing resource. Other books that you have in mind come today?
There's one that I cherished because C.S. Lewis was one of my father's favorite authors, and I have all of my father's copies of C.S. Lewis, as well as all of mine, because I bought them. But there was a slim volume that he wrote after his wife, Joy, died, called A Grief Observed. And it's just very meaningful. I gave it to my father when my mom died.
What was the title, please, again?
A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis. That recommendation comes from Ellen Johnson, and the previous one, The Phone Book at the End of the World from Bill Kinley. Some of you know When Breath Becomes Air. That's an excellent resource as well. These books that help us to come to be able to be present to grief. Anyone else with a recommendation today? Something that has helped you through? I read a lot of Mary Oliver. I find that is a great resource. I have two resources today that I'm going to tell you about that you can get online. The Comfortable Words by Erin Moon. If you just Google this, you should be able to download it. This one might cost us $2 or something. What gives you comfort doesn't always make you comfortable. The Comfortable Words. And I'll put this out if you want to take a look at it. I printed that out. And one that I've used in the grief and support groups that I sometimes run, The Morning After Grieving Someone You Love by John Pavlovitz. If you have not heard the name John Pavlovitz, he is a fantastic minister. He's semi-retired from that. He does writing. He's very active in political circles, so if you like Trump, you won't like him. But he is outspoken on those things. But also, he's done this great collection of essays on grief, and it goes through a variety of chapters. This is free online. I can also send either one of those to you as a PDF, so don't purchase anything. Just send me a note that you want them, and I will send them off to you. I also have, and you can take one of these today. You probably know we have a library off the sanctuary, the Stephen Ministry Library there in Hilligon's Chapel. We have a lot of books on a lot of topics of interest to you, but we have a whole selection on grief. So just today I lifted up, these are the books that are categorized as grief books in Hilligon's Chapel. And you can take a look and take one of these home with you. You can go in there and just take a book and check it out and see what you think, and just know to bring it back at some point. If you read something that you think is helpful or you want to share, I'm happy to bring it into that collection or to borrow it from you and see what we can do with it. I do plan to restart the grief conversations. We did that online during the pandemic for an hour a week we probably did that for 2 years.
Once a month for 2
Once a
years.
month, yeah, once a month for an hour. It was like the second Tuesday or something I'm gonna bring it back after February. I think it'll be the 19th of February that comes back. Just not able to do it before then, but I'll bring it back on, probably on Mondays, from 12 to 1. It'll be a lunch hour, and it's all Zoom. We don't meet in person. People just get online, and we just talk about where we are, and we help one another. The best thing about befriending grief is it brings you other companions to befriend, and that's a joy that comes with that, even if it's hard. So I hope you'll think about that and know, maybe share that. We have people that come from other churches, community. It's not a solely Christian thing. It's a person thing. It's a being alive thing. Okay, so in groups of 2 or 3, I would ask you to talk about a couple of questions. We're going to start with this one. Think of your own significant grief experience. How have you befriended grief?
what helped you to do that? What specific things helped you to have a more positive relationship with your grief? So just get in little groups of 2 or 3. Maybe if you came with a partner, pull in somebody that's not in your dyad so that you have just somebody else to talk to. And spend about 5 minutes on this, and I'm going to give you another question. Think of your own griefs. How have you befriended or not? What helps you, and what has helped you to have a positive relationship with your grief?
Yeah.
Thoughts that maybe you felt that you shared in your small group, or things that have come up, or I'll take any questions as well that you have. Any thoughts? Thoughts, questions, things that you're learning today? Such a difficult topic to talk about, but you've done really well today sharing with me, and I appreciate you being here and doing this
Well,
work.
Mel, this is kind of a personal question, so
Yeah.
you can dodge it if you want, but I often wonder how you absorb all the pain that you do in working with so many people, in doing all the services you do, bringing comfort into situations over and over and over
Yes.
again. And what is that like for you? And how do you, I mean, you're there for all of us, all of the time, but how do you fill your own, tank?
Yeah, I'll do my best to answer that question, Nancy, asking about how I manage all of the grief that I'm bearing, both professionally and personally, I think is the question.
Yeah.
I don't know. I will say that I think God has given me a particular resilience and ability to hold grief within my heart, but also to go forward and do what I need to do. I can't necessarily explain that. I think probably my life experiences have shaped some of that, starting at a young age with grief. I'll also say, and this will sound a little silly, but I don't think it's untrue. I grew up breeding dachshunds, and Nancy will appreciate this, as will Ellen, who has several at home. And with dachshunds, those cute, adorable little puppies, we would have these huge litters of puppies, and I would get to keep them for 8 weeks. And then they would go out the door, and a few months later, we'd have another adorable litter of cute puppies, and so on for most of my young elementary years. And I believe that it taught me something about loving the one that you're with and being present to the one who's with you. Once these puppies would leave us, I had no idea where they went or what happened to them. I had to hope and pray that they were happy little dogs. But at a young age, I learned to be present to the one whom you're with. And when I do this work with First Presbyterian, I grieve every loss of the members that I have come to love, but the next day there's 400 more that I need to love. And I've learned to honor those people in my mind when they come to my mind, to be attentive to that grief. Some of those losses are harder than others, but they all really matter to me. And so I take part in things like the All Saints Day service. The reading of the names is phenomenally comforting to me. The Longest Night service. I found things that I can participate in that help me. That said, I'm not super good at this. I have moments where I really have a tough time getting out of bed. And there are times when I just have to stay busy to not feel like I'm drowning in it, right? But it's all a negotiation with grief. It's the friend that I've befriended that sometimes I say, you're not welcome here today. Not today, Satan. Not today, grief. And so I also think, though, and the last thing I'll say about this is, from the perspective of working at this congregation, I see on a daily basis resilience and recovery. There's not a person I have grieved with here in this church who has succumbed to grief and gone away and ended their life or left forever. The people that are here that we grieve with, they get to the other side of it. And when I talk about other side, you know what I mean. I see them sometimes in the pew teary, and then a year later, I see them becoming a deacon and greeting friends and building relationships. And for 25 years, I have not been let down by the Holy Spirit who brings us to a new place. And I just know that in my mind when I'm with sad people. This next Saturday, I will help preside at the service of Mary Beth Gandy, my 54-year-old friend who died in that car accident in Dexter recently. That's going to be horrible. There's no way I can put a good spin on that for her 2 boys or her family, but I will do my best to help them celebrate her life and believe and trust that her spirit will be with them. And I will grieve her. Every time I think of her, there will be a pain there, but That's kind of what I do. Does that make sense to people? I will tell you that at the conclusion of every service here, sometimes grief comes in waves or patterns, and right now I'm in a particular place where I found myself looking up at the balcony during the benediction, and all I can see is Jim and our two little boys sitting there, and it's difficult to bear it, but it's also a gift to behold it. So when you see me looking up there, you know I'm not just looking to see who's sitting there. I'm remembering that was where my husband always sat, and that brings me some comfort. Other questions, comments? Sid?
This may not be something that you want to speak to or have put together kind of organized thoughts on, but it's an issue that I raised in the opening about the grief that more and more people are feeling about what's happening to the planet. That kind of totally absorptive, existential grief. And about the degree of violence and suffering and the ravages of historical events that are ongoing. Do you have any thoughts on, or do you have any recommendations on something to read about a kind of existential grief, not necessarily tied to people in our lives? Or
That's a great question. I was just given the book by, I believe his name is Gareth Higgins, called How Not to Fear. And it's an excellent resource on this topic. I'm just starting it. A life coach in town gave it to me. I think that what I would say is that grief is normal, it is expected, it is needed, but if it is a grief that keeps us from action, if it keeps us stuck because we're stuck in despair, then it has no purpose. It may be a natural reflection of where we are, but until we, if on our own sheer will only, but hopefully with the help of God, can turn it into a verb that's the only way that grief will ever go away.
What's the name of the book?
How Not to Fear by Gareth Higgins. But I just think that is, we all have days, but we can't stay there, or we will sink into it, right? And that we have to find out of that pain what will cause us to work together and work hard and work consistently, even though, boy, the tide feels like it's turning against us as a planet. And to remember what you've heard Dave Prentice Hyerson say, which was first quoted by William Sloane Coffin, which is that God's heart is the first to break. And so we have to feel the pain in a way that God must feel. And we are the hands and feet of God in this world. Whatever the divine love looks like, we are the ones who are here to do it. So we cannot give in and we cannot give up. Thanks. Other thoughts, questions? Ellen?
Well, I'm just gonna offer a comment here. It's a personal comment. Oh, really?
Oh, it's 2%.
Nah, it's all right.
They'll all be very grateful if you use it.
The reluctant like you.
Oh, yes. This is my shy self that's going, you can do it, honey, you can do it. Okay. Well, my mother died at Thanksgiving, and my father right after New Year's. And for a very, very long time, and another thing that's true about me, this is the first time I will say this in public, is that I've suffered from depression probably since I was an adolescent. Wasn't really recognized until I was an adult, but anyway, right now I don't suffer from it. It's just, it's like I wear glasses. Okay, what big deal? Just deal with it. I don't deal with it. I live with it. It's actually a good friend, but that's a whole nother topic. Okay?
That's another topic.
Whole nother topic. Anyway, so because of my mother and the way that she died, and some things that were attached to that, and then my father, and then at the beginning of November, for many, many years, it was always, the sad times are coming. And beginning in November, I would just go into a funk and just stay there until probably end of January. Because all of the sadness and the death and the loss was just so, it wasn't overpowering. It's just like, well, it's like our gray skies in Michigan. It would just come and then just wouldn't go away. Well, this year, I did something different, and my niece was born on the same day as my mother. My niece has cerebral palsy. She is an adult now, but she will be handicapped and need to be cared for the rest of her life. But she is a gift, and she's really smart. Her body doesn't work well, but her mind is really sharp. And I just love her dearly. And so this year, to celebrate her, and also more my mother, I bought flowers for the church. And I told my niece about it. She was really, really happy. So, and then I took a picture of the flowers, and I sent them to her. And she just thought that was really, really something to be remembered in that way. And so it was like transforming sadness that I was expecting to have come over me into something that was joyful and that was going forward, which is my niece. Took me 20 years, okay? But you know, there's so anyway, just wanted to share that because it was a really important gesture in trying to kind of not mourn, but grieve and celebrate at the same time. Yeah, and there you go.
Good words, good words. Thank you, Ellen. When you were talking about depression, you know, when we give a presentation like this, there's just so much we can't talk about, so much we can't possibly get to, right? The people that come alongside you that don't help you befriend grief, that say things that you can't believe they just said. That we could do a whole nother presentation, maybe next year we'll do that, on how to talk to people that say things they shouldn't say. But just know that I recognize that we're trying to just work with this one part of grief, but there are many other factors that come into play. And I would say, don't be hard on yourself if what you've heard today is difficult and not something you can work on doing. Just be where you are and try to keep loving yourself and the one that you've loved. I think that's really important. So any other questions or any comments? It's a real pleasure to be with you, and because you did this hard work today, you get a cookie on your way out. We will enjoy that. Know that our entire staff is here for you when you are in this place of grief and could use some one-on-one care. Our Stephen ministers are fantastic. We do have a grief book series that goes off. Many of you have gotten that. We have care kits that go out with other books. The Spirituality of Grief is the one that is in our comfort kit currently. It's a great book, The Spirituality of Grief. So if any of those resources are helpful, I'm just an email away. Please, the earlier you email me, even the better. So let us conclude in prayer. Surely, O God, you have borne our griefs, and you walk with us in the midst of all of it. We don't have easy answers or trite phrases, but we know that there are ways that we can carry on in this life with the inevitability of grief as something that we can learn to befriend or to be with or speak to or perhaps embrace in a different way. Help us to continue to learn and most of all to support one another, for what a beautiful gift to have a congregation where we walk together, where you can come here and sit in the pew with tears flowing down your face, and you will be loved and you will be accepted and you will not be alone. Lord, thank you for loving us in that particular way. We give you thanks this day through Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. We do have some resources on your way out. Cookies, please, and I will see you next week. We have, we're doing next week for adult formation.
And I didn't bring the brochure.
Oh, there is no adult formation. There's no Exploring the Faith next week because it's Jay. Jay's Jennifer's party. I think Exploring the Faith, I'm not sure about the Bible or the other classes, but this class will take a week off, and then we come back for a week on play with Diane Tamlin. That will be a lot of fun. We need some fun after today, right?
Thank you, Mel.
Here's